Welcome to the Student Ministry Matters podcast. We want to encourage, equip, and connect those with a passion to impact the next generation for Jesus Christ. Student ministry can be a lonely place. You might even feel like you're the only one in your church or community that cares about students. Well, know this, you're not alone. People all across the country are engaging Gen Z and care deeply about the spiritual direction of these young men and women. Whether you're full-time, part-time, bivocational, or volunteer, if you have a heart for students, this is the place for you.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm thrilled that you've chosen to join us for another conversation about student ministry. On today's podcast, I'll be sharing an interview I had with Dr. Jared Bumpers. Jared was a part of the writing team for Fulfill Your Student Ministry and serves as Assistant Professor of Preaching and Ministry at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary of Kansas City, Missouri. In addition to teaching, Jared is the Director of Student Life and Events. Prior to joining the team at Midwestern, Jared served for over a decade as a student pastor and then as an associate pastor of preaching at a church in southwest Missouri. He has also served as an interim pastor and spoken at numerous conferences throughout the United States. Jared holds a Bachelor of Science in Pastoral Ministry from Baptist Bible College in Springfield, Missouri, a Master of Divinity from Luther Rice Seminary, a Master of Theology in Biblical Studies from Liberty Baptist Theological Seminary, and a Ph.D. in Christian Preaching from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Jared is married to his wife, Kimberly, and they have 4 children, McCartney, Rush, Maverick, and Jet. Now, before we hop into the interview, let me encourage you to give our podcast a review. This is one of the ways that others find us. You can also share the podcast on social media if it's something that you're enjoying. And we welcome your feedback. We would love to hear from you. You can reach me at info@studentministrymatters.com or by calling my church at 479-442-4634. Well, let's hop right into our interview today and listen together. Well, Jared, thanks for being with us on the podcast today. I'm excited to share a little bit and to hear about you as we join in this conversation about student ministry. I know that you're part of the author team that put together Fulfill Your Student Ministry, and so it's great to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited. Been looking forward to having this conversation. So thank you for letting me join you.
Well, Jared, recently we've had Sam Burig on the podcast as well, and you're a member of the Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary team. You're up there in Kansas City. We know that there is a barbecue scene, and so we want to know, he's told us one place. What is your favorite barbecue place there in Kansas City?
Kansas City is known for their barbecue. We take our barbecue seriously here in Kansas City. My favorite place to grab barbecue is Q39, especially their burnt ends. And I would say Casey Joe's is a close second.
Okay. Well, he flipped those two, and so it's good to know. Yeah, and so I'm just looking forward for the time when I can come up and hang out and eat some barbecue, especially the burnt ends. Oh, love that stuff, man.
That's right. You can arbitrate and decide which one of us was correct.
That'd be great. Hey, listen, Jared, it's great to have you on the podcast. Can you just start? I want our listeners to get to know you a little bit better. So would you mind sharing your call to Christ and your call to ministry? What did that look like?
So I grew up, important part of who I am, my story. I grew up in a pastor's home, so heard the gospel from a young age. But I don't know if this is common or not with pastors' kids. I know some tend to be very faithful and love Jesus and are consistent all the way throughout. Others rebel and have no desire to follow Jesus, and whether that's high school, college, or later on. But I grew up in a pastor's home and heard the gospel, was very moral, good at rule following, but I was not converted until college, actually. And so was converted in college. God used, I got married at a young age as well. So was married at 20 and met my wife. And our first year of marriage was a rough year for us mainly due to my sin and selfishness. God used marriage to expose pride and selfishness. My wife and I both played basketball in college, and so basketball really became a kind of a wedge at times in our marriage, where I would go play pickup or go practice. She wanted to spend time together, and so I just wasn't considerate, selfish, prideful, and God used that to kind of open my eyes to my sinfulness and need for Christ. And so up to that point, I would have said that I was a Christian, but didn't truly have an understanding of my sinfulness and need for Christ. So I consider myself a good person, obeyed most of the major commands. I wasn't doing drugs, wasn't sleeping around, having sex. And so I thought I was a good person, didn't truly see my need for Christ. And so God used those sins on the inside, those more subtle sins of the heart, to expose my lostness and need for Jesus. And so was converted in college, and so had a desire for ministry, and went to, I was at a Christian college at the time, did a degree in pastoral ministry and Bible. So graduated from there and in May of 2007, and started working as a student pastor at a church in October of 2007. And so that's kind of my conversion, call to ministry. And yeah, I can add to that as much as you need me to.
Oh man, that's great. That's great. Well, where did you go to college at?
So I went to Baptist Bible College, a small Baptist college in Springfield, Missouri.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it. So, well, how are you serving the kingdom now through your local church?
So we moved to Kansas City. So I was a student pastor for 9 years on staff at a church, and then I was a teaching pastor for 2 years on staff at a church. And then I moved to Kansas City, and I'm on staff here, director of student life and events, and then also do some teaching. I'm assistant professor of preaching and Christian ministry here at the seminary. And so my vocation is no longer the local church, and yet I love the church. Christ died for the church. And so my wife and I serve every other week. We work with our children at the church that we attend, that we're members at. We work with 2 and 3 year olds. So I teach the Bible to 2 and 3 year olds, which is a challenge, different than being a teaching pastor and teaching adults for sure. But then the weeks that I'm not teaching, at least once a month, sometimes twice a month, I'll do pulpit supply. I did a 6-week interim pastorate, interim preaching role for a guy that took a sabbatical for the first 6 weeks of this year. And so I try to be connected and plugged in and serve the church that my family and I are members at, but at the same time, still try to preach pretty consistently.
Oh, that's great. I love your commitment to the local church. I know that when guys that are in the ministry become involved with a school or a parachurch organization, there can be that tendency to not be as connected to the local church. But man, that's Christ died for the church, and we know that. And so that leads right into you wrote 2 chapters in the book, Fulfill Your Student Ministry, and I loved the book. I loved what I saw there, the encouragement that I found in it. Even how it's laid out. I thought it was a fantastic piece. And so I want to thank you for your contribution. You had 2 chapters, one on local church and student ministry, and the other one was on mission trips or be involved in evangelism. And so let's just take a look at those. In the first chapter that you shared with, you talked about the local church. So let me ask this: what has led churches to see students as just future contributors?
I think a lot of it honestly has to do with their age, because they're young. There's this assumption that in the present, they don't really have much to offer. And so at some point, they'll grow up, they'll mature, but right now, kids will be kids.
Yeah.
They're the youth. And so I think a lot of the idea of students being the future of the church stems from just their age. So, and I tackle that some in my chapter. I think that's a faulty view. Yeah. If they've been converted and baptized, they're and accepted into the membership of the local church, they should be treated as members. We should hold them accountable. We should give them ministry opportunities within the body to serve. and to treat them like you would any other believer within the church.
Yeah. Well, in my local context, I noticed one of our more senior saints posted on Facebook that, this idea that I'm so happy that we have these younger college age students. They're the church of tomorrow.
Mm.
And I hate to hear that for this reason, because they're the church of today, and they are investing. One of these young people are investing. They're teaching our kids on Wednesday nights. They are just super involved. So we've got to work to combat that. And so, how else do you combat that mentality within the body that they're just future contributors?
So there are a lot of ways to do this. I'm not claiming to be able to provide an exhaustive list of ways to do that, but some practical things that I think would help us view them as part of the body right now. One of the simplest things I think we can do is to keep young people in corporate worship services on the Lord's Day.
Yeah.
I want to word this as politely as I can, but I am not in favor of holding separate youth services on Sundays, where the students have their own service, they have their own music, they have their own sermon, and the adults worship in one place and the students are off somewhere else doing their own thing. And I think even to your first question, that's another thing that's contributed to this view that the students someday will become part of the church. But right now, they're somewhere else in a different part of the building or a different building altogether doing their own thing. And so I think bringing them back, if you've got them separated, bringing them back into worship, letting them hear the pastor preach the word on a Sunday, I think is huge. I mean, I know that's ground zero, but to me that's so important. It's unbelievable to me that a student could go through the nursery, go through our children's ministry, go through our student ministry, and never regularly hear their pastor preach the word until they're in college.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a big issue. Especially as you get into larger churches. I don't see it as much, of course, in many of our churches because of their size. We don't have enough for a youth worship, but I don't think it's about size. I think it's about the ability to, for one, if you have a teenager and they are sitting there in the pew with their mom and dad, or just their mom or just their dad, and they can look over and see them sing and see them pray and see them listen and maybe take notes and engage with what's being said. Not only are they hearing the word, they're also seeing these things lived out by their family. And so it's a really important thing. So let me ask, and this isn't really on our list, and I'm just kind of curious where you fall on this, is at what point do we transition them to that worship service?
Man, I'm in favor of the younger, the better. So I lean on the early end there. I definitely think fifth grade is too late.
Right.
For me, second to third grade is, for me, not ideal, but I could deal with that. But I think once they hit kindergarten, they're sitting in a class setting, learning in that environment. I think we can move them into a corporate worship service as early as kindergarten. I would say as late as second or third grade, but anything beyond that, for me, again, I don't have a chapter or verse for that, but for me, and for the reasons you mentioned, having mom and dad there, opening up their Bible, looking and listening to the pastor preach the word, singing songs, all of those things shape them. And so I would want them doing those things as soon as possible. And even to the question earlier, the only thing I mentioned was not separating them. But some of the other things that I would say as far as connecting them to the body, if you do have them in the service, incorporate them in the service. So maybe say, well, it's not an issue for us. We have our students in there with us. Well, if they're in there with you, in what ways are they serving? In what ways are they participating? If that means having them help take up the offering, run the sound, greet people, or pass out a bulletin at the door, whatever that looks like, whatever the other adults are doing in that room, give the students opportunities to serve in those same ways. And so I would say make sure that you keep them in the worship service, make sure that you give them opportunities to serve in all kinds of different ministries. And then I would also say disciple them and discipline them the same way you would an adult. So they don't get a free pass if they're involved in some type of sin. They don't get a free pass because they're a student. There is no, boys will be boys, and so this happened. No, that sin needs to be addressed. If they have publicly professed to follow the Lord Jesus Christ and there's sin in their life that's evident, that needs to be challenged and addressed. And so I would say we need to treat them, involve them in corporate worship services, treat them like we would the adults as far as giving them opportunities to serve, holding them accountable, exercising church discipline. And again, there's a lot that could be said under each of those things, and nuance is necessary when you're dealing with minors who are living at home with parents, and what does a church discipline look like. But as a whole, I would say those are healthy practices to make sure that students are not disconnected. They're attending worship, they're serving in worship, they're being discipled and held accountable. All those things are important to make sure that students are connected to the body.
Yeah. One of the biggest challenges that I've faced with students is that they will come on a Wednesday night for youth group. We would invest in them, pour into them. They might come on, we had another group that would meet on Sunday nights. And so we would be separated again from our, the adults. But is getting those students that would come into that setting to make that transition over to Sunday worship.
Yeah.
And at the time I knew it was important, but I didn't realize how important it was. And so we would occasionally see that transfer over, but it was so rare. It was so hard to make that shift because students have become focused in on the fun or the excitement or even just the difference in worship style.
Yes.
And so that's, I've really struggled with that now as I've looked back and gone, oh, my worship should have matched.
Yes. Yeah. And that's
for that type of thing.
I've got a section in my chapter, I think, on that very thing. And I'm in agreement with you. I think to the best of our ability, what we do in a midweek service, so it's not the Sunday morning gathering, but a midweek service, we're seeking to shape students spiritually. To the best of our ability, we want that to model what's happening on a Sunday. So we're praying, we're reading scripture, we're worshiping, we're preaching the word, not to replace Sunday morning. We want them to come on Sundays, and we want them to serve, we want them to worship, but to reinforce what they're seeing and what they're hearing. And I think one of the things that's happened, you always hear the horror statistic of, close to 80% of the students who graduate high school walk out the doors and never come back. They never come back to the church, and they're no longer part of the church. And every time I hear that statistic, I don't know if it's a cynic in me, but I always think, how many of them were actually a part of the church in the first place? Were they part of the church, right, or were they just part of your midweek gathering? And those are two separate things.
They are.
And so you can have students who come on Wednesday night for the pizza and the dodgeball and the devotional and high energy stuff, but they're not going to come on Sunday because what happens on Sunday is completely different. And so they graduate high school and the pizza and the dodgeball is done, and now they're expected to listen to the word preached and to join in corporate worship and to participate in the actual life of the body. And they don't have a frame of reference for that. And so I think it can be problematic.
Yeah, they can be absolutely clueless on what to even do when it comes to worship. And so, I don't know your background. I know with me, I grew up in my high school years were spent in a small church. We had about 75 people. And so, I would go, I would be involved. I got chances for ministry because it was a smaller church. What was your setting like?
Yeah. So, for a lot of it, it was the same thing. My dad was a pastor. His first pastorate was in Northeast Mississippi. So very, very rural setting, probably 150-ish people in the church. So in that setting, same thing. I had opportunities to greet people, to pass out bulletins, to take up the
Right.
offering,
Yep.
and then from there, he pastored a church in North Carolina for a couple of years, and then took a church of about 150 in Springfield, Missouri, Southwest Missouri, and a similar thing. I mean, there were 6 students in the youth group, and I mean, we sat in church on Sundays, we listened to the word preached, we sang, and yeah, we participated and had opportunities then to teach, and I couldn't sing, but had opportunities to sing in the student choir. And so,
Yeah.
again, at that point wasn't a believer, but I knew the Bible was very religious, but was not regenerate at that point. But
Right.
anyways, I had
But
opportunities to do those things.
yeah, and I think what you did see was that you saw its importance.
Mm-hmm.
It was being modeled out in front of you. You were being shown, and by being a part of that service, you saw people of all different ages embrace that message and understand it. And so, yeah, that can be powerful. Well, in that chapter, you express a need for students to break out of a me-centered attitude to a God-centered one. And I really like those concepts that they shared. So, how has the church contributed to a me-centered attitude over the years?
I don't want to keep pounding on this, but I think part of our attractional mindset over the past, and again, I'm not perfect in this. I think early on in my ministry, I would say that I struggle with this of what can I do to capture students' attention and to get them to come to church.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you try to come up with the craziest icebreakers that you can, the coolest
Yeah.
activities that you can. What's the funnest thing that I can possibly conceive to get them to come? And so what you're really doing is you're just appealing to their desires and saying, this is about you, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to get you. And so you end up changing what you're doing into a very individual and man-centered ministry, rather than, hey, we're here because God has made us in His image and He's created us to bring Him glory. He sent His Son to redeem us and to reconcile us to God. And so we're here to worship. We're here to hear Him speak, and we're here to be conformed to the image of His Son, Jesus Christ. And so if we lose sight of those things, that God created us, that He created us for His glory, that Christ has died to redeem us from the curse of the law, to reconcile us to God, that His ultimate goal, it is to conform us to the image of Christ. We know that all things work together for those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. Those that He foreknew, He predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son. If I can hold some of those truths up for them to say, it's not just about you. God didn't create you, and He didn't redeem you for you to live for you. He created you to be conformed to the image of Jesus Christ, and He created you to love Jesus, to obey His commands, to share the gospel, to produce good works, and to make a difference. And so, again, those are to me, those are two very different things. And I think I learned that the hard way, where early in my ministry, it was about you and what can I do for you. And then later on, it was this kind of reorientation to, actually, this is not about you. This is about us doing what God has created us to do. And that's to orient our lives around Him. And so for me, that was a huge shift.
One of the things that, unfortunately, I think that many of us maybe spent those early years in ministry, and hopefully others will get it right before, the amount of time it took me to figure it out. It was almost more like I was a Christian social worker dealing with students. I'd look at what was going to fix them or what was going to help them and why that was important to them, rather than focusing in on the big mission that God had for us. And so it can be tough. It can be hard. Well, what are some ways, in a very practical mindset, best opportunities to connect students to ministry? You mentioned a couple. Get them handing out bulletins, maybe sing. What do you have? Some other things in mind?
Yeah, I do. I think there is, and a lot of this to me is looking at what you're what ministries your church has and then plugging students into them. And so I would say,
Sure.
for the most part, there are very few ministries that I would prohibit students from serving in. And so whether that's welcoming people to the door, passing out bulletins, running the sounds, singing in the choir, praying, if you have a time of prayer and you open that up to congregants to pray, allowing students to pray, allowing students to teach, especially if you have a Sunday school hour during your service times, either before or after, however you structure that. If you have classes that meet on site, especially if you have classes of students that meet on site, allow students, maybe not every week, but allow students to teach one another the Bible. Give them opportunities to study and to teach, to use their gifts there. Take them on mission trips. I know we'll talk about that later on, but take them on mission trips. If your church has an outreach program, take them to share the gospel, whether that's door-to-door evangelism, follow-up for unbelievers who have attended. When I was a student pastor, we used to take our students downtown on our upperclassmen, so juniors and seniors. We would take them downtown and just kind of hang out at the square and start conversations with people and share the gospel. And so, again, I think the sky's the limit as far as engaging them and giving them opportunities to serve in ministry.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing that list, though, because that can maybe spark some of our listeners as they're trying to think, okay, how do I engage my students in ministry? And you gave lots of different ideas, but the main thing is to just look at your church. Maybe it's better to be thinking about why they shouldn't be involved in certain ministries, and then the rest are kind of a wide open field. And so I would recommend, talking, of course, with your lead pastor.
Mm-hmm.
If you're the student ministry worker, make sure that he's on the same page, but you want to get them involved. I know that you already mentioned it, and let's go ahead and go right into it, because I'm a big fan of student mission trips.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a chapter on it. You talk about it. One of the philosophies that I have been carrying with me for the past several years is that I would like for every one of my students to have that opportunity before they graduate to go somewhere, either in the country or outside of the country, to share the gospel, to be on mission for a time, so that they could understand what that's like. And so it's not always easy to get parents behind that same sort of philosophy, or sometimes even the students, but it can be such a powerful thing. My own two kids have gone to different places. My son went to Romania twice. My daughter's been to Peru, as well as deep South Texas, where she worked with some folks there. So they've been on mission trips. I've been on things in the state. It's just eye-opening for our students.
It is.
So I do have a question. Mission trips have looked different over the years, and have often been about helping in physical ways. Let's go, let's build this, let's go and paint this, or, those type of things. But you make a case for a change that focuses on sharing the gospel. Could you expand on that need?
Yes, I do want to state up front, because I've gotten a little bit of pushback on this, and I would affirm everything that I've written, and I wouldn't make any changes to it. But I do want to make a caveat that I'm not minimizing service projects or
Right.
meeting physical needs. So I just want to be clear that I think those things are important. If you're going to help with a construction project, or to paint, or a school, that needs help, you're painting a school, whatever that may look like, you're serving people. That's an important thing. What I'm driving at in that chapter is, don't call that a mission trip, because what you're doing is a service project. The idea that this is a mission trip and it doesn't involve sharing the gospel, to me, misses the heartbeat of what missions is about. And so missions, I think, has to be connected to the gospel and to evangelism. And the purpose of that trip is to share the gospel with people who don't know Jesus, or who have never heard the gospel. And so what I'm driving at in that chapter is let's step back from what we're doing. We call all of these things mission trips. And if everything is a mission trip, then nothing is a mission trip. And so
Yeah.
let's step back, evaluate what we're doing, and the service projects, that's great. I'm not saying don't do those things. I'm just saying we want to train our students to share the gospel, to emphasize the gospel, to engage in mission, and for them to be clear when they're doing those things. So, I could say a lot about this, and this is one of those
Hmm.
things that honestly I learned the hard way. I went on a mission trip my first year as a student pastor, and spent a week doing manual labor, and it was great. I enjoyed serving, and yet at the end of the week, I was discouraged because, man, I went excited about telling somebody about Jesus, sharing the gospel.
Yeah.
This ministry had branded this as a mission trip, and so I got there and was just discouraged and disappointed because I wanted to tell somebody about Jesus. And so I just think we need to make sure that we're not deceiving our students and saying, "Hey, this is what missions is," because this may seem to some people like a small thing, but if you really slow down and think about it, if I take my students on mission trips, quote unquote mission trips, for 4 years, and all we do is service projects, I'm driving home this idea that missions is really just about service projects.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to end up graduating Christian students who think that missions is just being nice and doing good things for people. And so without minimizing the importance of good deeds and serving our neighbor and loving our neighbor, I want to be clear with them that, hey, you should do these things, but use the words of Jesus, do this, but don't leave the other undone. Make sure that you share the gospel, that you're telling people about Jesus Christ, because that's what missions is really about.
Yeah, I totally agree. Missions is about sharing the gospel. I think one of the areas that many of us struggle with, and maybe we're not naturally gifted or supernaturally gifted, rather, in the area of evangelism, is that we struggle on how to tell people about Jesus and in translating that to our students, so they don't necessarily know how to present the gospel. So, what are some of the best ways to train our students in that type of arena?
Yeah, I really like, for me, that kind of the big story. I can give you three. And so when I work with
Yeah.
students, I try to provide multiple methods of sharing the gospel. So here are three ways to do it. Whichever one of these you are most comfortable or most familiar with, adopt this method. Or for some of the more spiritually mature students, you have all three of these at your disposal. And depending on how
Oh,
the
yeah.
conversation goes,
Yeah.
you can pick and choose for each of them. So for me, one is kind of the big story, the meta narrative of the Bible. It's kind of a biblical theological approach, where you talk about creation, fall,
Hmm.
redemption, restoration. And so, in the creation aspect, and again, this is similar to another one that I'll mention, but in the creation aspect, you're talking about the character of God, that God created everything he created is good. So you have his sovereignty, his omnipotence, his holiness, all of those things kind of wrapped up into God made this world. Everything that he made is good. A good God creates a good world. Then you have the fall, so sin, you talk about the importance of sin. God made man, and he made man good, and man rebelled, disobeyed the one command. Sin entered into the world, and from that point forward, every person was affected and infected by sin. And so you kind of unpack that, and again, in the sin element, you're really talking about sinfulness and depravity. Man is sinful. Man is incapable of saving himself. It's not like we can fix this problem by doing good things. And again, depending on how advanced a student is, they can bring other verses into this, but just as a general framework, God creates, man sins and rebels and is incapable of saving himself, but Christ came to redeem. So the redemption element, Christ came to redeem us from the curse of the law. We're sinners, separated from God, deserving of death, but Jesus did what we could never do. He perfectly obeyed the commands of God. He never sinned. He who knew no sin became sin for us. And so in the redemption, you move to substitution. Christ, God in human flesh, born of a virgin, lived a sinless life, the life that we could never live. But then he took our sin and died the death that we deserved. And then he came back to life. He rose from the dead, and he offers eternal life and forgiveness of sins to every person who will repent and believe the gospel. And so there's a response required here. And so Christ dies to redeem us. Man must repent and believe the gospel. And then there's this promise that one day Christ will return and he'll restore everything, no more sin, sickness, sorrow, death. And so that you end on this note of hope. And so working through kind of a big picture framework is one. And then the other two, I won't go into as much detail, but the Romans Road, I think, is a helpful a helpful tool. I know it's maybe more old school, not as hip or relevant, but again, I think Romans 3:23, 6:23, 5:8, 10:9 and 10 is a good. Those are definitely good verses to have in your back pocket as you're sharing the gospel. I'm looking for kind of more universal salvation statements. And then one last one that I have always appreciated, J.I. Packer in Evangelism and the Sovereignty of God, and then Greg Gilbert in What is the Gospel. Both of them use the same four things: God, man, Jesus, and then response. I think is the four big building blocks that they use. But talk about God, the holiness of God. God is creator. Then man's sinfulness and inability to save himself. The work of Christ, obeying who Christ is, or the person of Christ. So you talk about the deity of Christ, the sinlessness of Christ, then the work of Christ, substitution, propitiation, redemption, and then the fourth one is our response, so repentance and faith. And so those three, I think, are some form or shape of each of those three is a good starting point when you're talking about sharing the gospel with students.
Yeah. Well, if you go on a mission trip, and a mission trip to share the gospel, you got to know the message.
Yeah,
and so we got to be mindful of that, and to be teaching our students to let them know how to do that, and to maybe practice with one another. I've gone through Evangelism Explosion myself, and the on-the-job training where you would go back and forth with a partner. That's helpful. Very helpful stuff to do. Well, Jared, I really appreciate you taking some time out today to share about your involvement with Fulfill Your Student Ministry. I am going to encourage our guys, and I would love to see them pick up this little book and read everything you have to say, as well as the other authors. If someone wanted to contact you about speaking to their group, or had questions about something you wrote in the book, or want to know more about your ministry at Midwestern, what would be the best way to contact you?
Yeah, the easiest way to get a hold of me is probably just through email. My email at the seminary is jbumpers, BUMPERS, at mbts.edu. So jbumpers at mbts.edu would probably be the easiest way to get a hold of me. And again, if they can look me up on the website. They can just, if they Google Jared Bumpers, it'll pull up, I'm sure, on MBTS's webpage. So awesome.
Well, do you have anything else that you're involved with? Any new books in mind?
Well, I am working on a project right now. I'm only about 30 pages into it, but I'm working on a project on a theology of preaching, basically the theological framework for redemptive historical exposition. So,
all right. Well, we'll be looking for that in the future. Again, Jared, thank you so much for being with us today. Have a great week.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. You too.
Thanks for listening to the Student Ministry Matters podcast. Get connected at studentministrymatters.com or follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Student Ministry Matters. Until next time, keep up the great work with your students, because the work matters.